Good afternoon. Thank you so much for registering for the webinar on addressing youth perpetrating word violence with Mr. Donald Findlater. This is the first of the webinars Thulir is hosting on the subject of addressing sexual violence, and we hope to see you all register for some more. Over to you, Donald.
Thanks, Vidya. Shall I take it from here?
Yes, please.
Okay. I'm going to make an assumption that everyone can hear all right, but I'm delighted to have been afforded this opportunity from Julia to address this issue. So I'm visiting from the UK. I have to tell you, I'm not particularly familiar with the Indian context, but I have been working in various parts of the world, primarily in the UK, to make sure that children are safer and to make sure that adults do the best they can to protect children from child sexual abuse. By background, I'm a probation officer in the UK. As I'm speaking at these introductory comments, by the way, some adjustments are being made to the acoustics, just in case they're not being heard very well. So this is. I arrived in India only a few hours ago, so I hope I'll stay awake for this next hour or so. I wish I could see you all, but I clearly can't, and I'm addressing a room of only 3 other people. But so I work for a small NGO over in the UK, working precisely tackling child sexual abuse, and some of my colleagues in the organisation work with youth perpetrators. But the drive over the last 10 or 12 years has been towards prevention, and that's where I'd like to take us in a fairly kind of quick succession. Now I'm finding my laptop isn't working for me right now. So here we go. And the essence of what I want to talk about is supporting those who've offended sexually to lead good lives, whether those are adults who've offended sexually against children, whether they're young people who've offended sexually against children. That's the bottom line. Yes, there can be all manner of punishments and accountabilities we would want for them, but if we help them once we've encountered them to lead good lives, we're helping them not to do the harm that they clearly have the potential to do again. What I want to cover in this period of time is looking at the scale of the problem of child sexual abuse. We need, whenever we're talking about child sexual abuse, we need to see the breadth of the context. Want to say something, my terrain from the UK mostly has been working with adult sex offenders, and not only working with them and assessing them, but also providing treatment programs in prisons and in the community, but also then moving to an understanding of youth perpetrators, because there are some aspects of understanding youth perpetrators and youth treatment programs that are similar, but other aspects that are profoundly different. And just talking about adult perpetrators and treatment programs won't help us grapple properly with those who perpetrate as youth. But then I want to kind of pause a little and think much more vocally and collaboratively about what prevention looks like. And I want to then take a case study, no, not from India, not from the UK, but actually from Aboriginal community down in Queensland in Australia, to consider what are the range of things we need to do to prevent children experiencing sexual abuse. Because bottom line, as an adult, I feel the best we can do for children is we prevent abuse in the first place. It's not good enough to simply respond well after it's happened. We need to have a strategy for preventing it happening in the first place. And that's where this case study hopefully will help us start thinking about what that might look like. But setting the scene, we need to kind of understand a little about the nature of the problem before we actually get into trying to solve the problem. And this is primarily taken from the UK and my understanding from there. And there was so much that we got wrong. And I speak as a professional, social worker and probation officer. I speak also as a father and a grandfather. I used to think that the risk to children was small. And what we've come to gather over the years is it is not small by any means. At least 1 in 10 children, in some studies 1 in 4, 1 in 5 children experiences sexual abuse as a child. This is not a small risk, this is not a small problem, therefore we have to scale up all our responses to match the size of this problem, with all the consequences, adverse consequences it has for children. Used to think that most children would disclose abuse. I work with perpetrators. I assume that children would disclose. In fairness, what we've found over the years is that most children do not disclose. Whether sometimes they never disclose, sometimes they wait for years to disclose. And there's a study from the UK that I'll come up to shortly that will say something about that. But the reality is most children who are sexually abused do not disclose that abuse for a range of reasons that we need to get better at understanding in order to help them disclose, because we know the sooner they're disclosed, the sooner they're believed and made safe, then the better the recovery will be. But the starting place has to be giving children the confidence to disclose if abuse has happened to them in the first place. We used to also think in the UK sex offenders were male, and of course that remains the case. The vast majority of sex offenders are male. Yes, they're mostly male adults, but there's a lot of adolescent males involved in the crime of sexual abuse as well. And we also need to factor in the fact that probably somewhere between 5 and 10% of all child sexual abuse committed by females, some adolescents and of course some adults. And in the UK, the conversation is about stranger danger and the risk to children of strangers sexually assaulting them. And we can't entirely say that's not true. What we know is the vast majority of sexual crimes are committed by people known to the child, probably within the family constellation or other known and trusted adults or adolescents. Strangers are a relative rarity. We have to have strategies to deal with them as well, of course. And there used to be a story that sex offenders were different. We'd like to think of them, and some studies that globally have tried to figure out whether they're shorter, whether they have wider foreheads, whether they look different. Some individuals, of course, lack some social skills, but by and large, sex offenders look very similar to all the rest of us. Looking for difference is largely not a fruitful area of endeavour. What else? You think that sex offenders were fathers. What we gathered over in the UK over the last 10, 12 years is that yes, some fathers, a small minority of fathers, sexually abuse their children, but the vast amount of fathers do not. Therefore, they have a vital role to play in keeping their children safe, and we must not diminish the possibility of fathers playing that vital role of keeping their children safe. We need to arm them with information and the skills to do that. We used to think that sex offenders don't want to stop or they can't stop. And range of projects, whether it's a Stop It Now project in the UK, Stop It Now in the US, Stop It Now in Holland, and the Dunkelfeld project in Germany has shown that typically men troubled by their sexual thoughts will seek out help if they can get help, especially if they can get it confidentially. And we have an online self-help resource that over back in the UK we launched to do with people viewing indecent images of children. We've seen 50,000 individuals from the UK visit that Get Help site in order to help them manage their online behaviour, to help them stop viewing indecent images of children. So we know lots of sex offenders or lots of people worried about their thoughts want the thought to stop, want their behaviour to stop. And we need to support them and manage them so that their behaviour does stop, because that's the best way of serving children tomorrow. But there are some who don't want to stop, of course. We need to recognise those people and do what we can about that. And there's some that don't have the skills or the social competence to stop. And we need to understand that and somehow prop them up in all manner of ways in order to ensure that desistance happens. That sometimes may involve incarceration for lifetime, sadly. I used to think that we caught the majority, that sex offenders were people that were in prison or that police and social services engaged with. What we've come to learn is that we don't catch anything like the majority, partly because most victims don't tell, and partly because even when they do tell, the majority of alleged perpetrators do not get a criminal conviction in any court of law. Used to think that treatment would achieve little, but we've learned that actually treatment can make some significant gains for individuals to help reduce their overall risk. It also generates information so that those around the individuals can better manage, help them manage, or externally manage the risk that And the challenge of recent years, clearly the new that's been arriving in shed loads has been to do with online offenders, people viewing indecent images of children, people kind of trying to groom children online or arrange to meet with them to abuse them offline. And that story of the internet is really causing us to challenge our thinking about who sex offenders are, what they do. But in terms of those, the vast numbers of people viewing indecent images of children online, in various countries of the world they would call that child pornography. It would appear that the vast majority of those people are not directly dangerous to children. However, by viewing those images, they're contributing to the harm done to those children whose images are online, and therefore it is not a victimless crime that they're committing, and they need to stop, they need to realise the skills to stop, get the support to stop, and there'll be consequences if they don't, including law enforcement, loss of family, loss of job, etc. So, things I'm currently looking at before moving on to understanding the problem of sexual abuse and understanding something about treatment. Looking at the issue of adolescent onset of sexual offending versus adult onset of sex offending. It used to be thought that sex offenders started their behaviour in adolescence and just kept acting on it throughout their adult life. What we now know from research, in certainly Australia, in the UK and elsewhere, is that there are two peak times for onset. One, yes, is adolescent years, but we also know that most adolescents don't continue perpetrating into adulthood. The other age of onset is in adult years, typically between 35 and 45, where we see another peak of people starting to sexually offend against children, typically teenagers, and there are a range of circumstances around that, whether that's to do with their online life, whether it's to do with a life crisis, whether it's to do with mental illness, depression, substance misuse, all sorts of factors that may contribute. But we're seeing these two very significant starting points for sexual offending, one in adolescence, one in adulthood. But the news is, though, that yes, it helps to get caught so that people stop, but some people will stop anyway. We mustn't assume once a sex offender, always a sex offender. And this issue of adult onset also has implications for recruitment practices, but that's another seminar for another day. We need to think about the kind of exploring the impact on children and young people's forming minds about online pornography and the culture and attitudes in children and young people. So what is pornography doing to the way children's attitudes to sex and sexuality and each other is happening? What is taking place there that is potentially giving us a far bigger sexual abuse problem than we've ever had before? And what can be done to mitigate that risk? Indeed, what is online pornography doing to the adult population who are viewing increasing quantities of adult sexual material, but many of them migrating to look at images of children as well in that online environment? So we need to look at that, see what changes it's creating, and put some fixes in place. Then there's a notion of situational prevention. A lot of the kind of the work of prevention thinks about how do we get children to make themselves safer, how do we get sex offenders to stop doing what they're doing. But there is opportunities in situations, whether it's institutions, indeed whether it's the home, where we can make changes that will is happening. So that the area of situational prevention, I think, is a growth area at the moment, and we'll have some exciting developments coming out over the years ahead. And again, I'll turn to that towards the close. And I'm looking at the development of prevention strategies in various parts of the globe, including East Africa and Eastern Europe, and hopefully in further conversation over here in India as well. So that was just about kind of setting the scene a little bit. And just to say something about the scale as we understand it back in the UK of child sexual abuse. What we know is that some 1 in 6 children are being sexually abused by the age of 17, 1 in 6. 8 out of 10 of those children know their abusers, and the vast, vast majority of that abuse is not reported to the police. So this is a number of studies done over a number of years that have been confirmed by a couple of recent reports. The global status reports from on violence prevention from the World Health Organization says the story internationally is remarkably similar to the UK. And I've given you the slides so you can see the references, and hopefully we'll pick them up later on. Back in the UK, the Office for the Children Commissioner looked at sexual harm to children and came out with these rather staggering kind of pieces of information. that over a 2-year period in England, with a population of about 55, 58 million, that there was an estimated 400 to 450,000 children abused over a 2-year period. Only 1 in 8 of the victims are known to the police or children's services. 60% of all those offences took place in the environment of the family, and over 30% of the abusers were other children or young people. So, staggering piece of information that requires us to respond well and to actually look at the scale, look at the features of young perpetrators, but also the family context, and figure out solutions that will best address those. No one thing we can do will prevent child sexual abuse. We will need a range of interventions. Arresting and convicting sex offenders does not prevent their first crime. Therefore, we have to figure out ways of preventing that first crime and doing the best by children so that they're protected, but also best by the offender, because offending changes offenders. It doesn't help to become a sex offender, and therefore let's help them to not commit that first crime. The intranet, as I've indicated, is introducing new challenges and new risks, but also new opportunities for alerting and educating and managing those risks. So whilst there is a dark side to that, there's also maybe some lighter spots in it as well. Well, who are the abusers? It was no surprise from what I've said before that adult males, significantly the majority of those who sexually abuse children, but not all of them. So adult females represent 5 to 10% of the problem. Children, young people, mostly male, represent about 30% of the problem of child sexual abuse. And therefore, our strategies for prevention and response need to relate to these information. So if that's something of the scale and the challenges that we're facing, then how do we start to face them? How do we start to look at the nature of this problem and understand it, yes, case by case, but also how do those cases inform the prevention efforts we need to think about, but also the treatment efforts we need to deploy to adult sex offenders, but also to youth who sexually abused. Some of you will be familiar with David Finkelhorst's 4 preconditions model from back in the mid-1980s. I will just run through it very briefly. I have found it through doing sex offender treatment programs, working with families where abuse has happened, but also educating parents in schools and other environments. They find this model extremely practical, extremely helpful, and it also gives us some striking clues about what prevention might start to look like and who is actively and should actively be involved in prevention and indeed in response. So a reminder, David Finkel will talk about 4 preconditions to child sexual abuse, and at the end of this journey, to the right of the screen, portray this as a journey with a beginning and an end point, and at the end point, a child has been sexually abused, but there's lots happening before that child is abused, and that starts with the motivation developing in the potential perpetrator, developing sexual thoughts involving children, and that motivation coming from a range of places, and as I've indicated, the motivation might arise in adolescence, but equally might arise in adult life. What we are seeing is people that are growing up with poor, inadequate social skills, so blockage to adult relationships typically, but also an emotional, as David Finkel talked about, an emotional congruence with children, that helps them think positively about children, but unfortunately in a sexual way, at a time when their outlets for their emotions and their sexual desires are blocked in terms of the adult expression of those. So motivation develops, and there's lots of features within that motivation and lots of triggers for it, and that will include, for some, having been sexually abused as children. But that's not the majority, and most victims of sexual abuse do not go on to become perpetrators. So the offender begins that journey by developing a motivation. He, mostly he, sometimes she, will, in order to continue this journey, will need to wrestle with their conscience to make it feel okay to do what it is they want to do sexually to a child. And in my experience, having worked residentially in sex offender treatment for rather a lot of years, most sex offenders do not want to directly do harm to children. They just don't understand that they are. They sort of beguile themselves that this is mutual, that this is wanted, that there's no harm done, or the child was asleep so they wouldn't notice, or the child sort of seemed to be reciprocating what was going on. Yes, of course, there is a small minority of sex offenders who are callous and maybe psychopathic, and who are interested in causing direct harm and suffering. But in my experience, that is not the majority. The majority somehow think there's nothing terribly bad about their behaviour, and that they're not causing that much harm in what they're doing, if any harm at all. So offenders, motivated, wrestling with their conscience to make it okay to do what they want to do, and that's not a one fix. They will have to wrestle with that for a period of time, and even after abuse they'll have to wrestle with it again if they're going to continue to abuse, and sometimes that conscience will trigger back to them after abuse, and that will help them to not repeat that behaviour. But anyway, conscience you've got as a factor that's vital in terms of how sex offenders do or don't commit a crime or the next crime. And the third obstacle, or the third kind of precondition that David Findlater talked about, he talked about external inhibitors. I speak as a parent and as a grandparent, and I know that I become then an obstacle to someone who might want to sexually abuse my child or my children or my grandchildren. That somehow I need to be alert, I need to pay attention, I need to do practical things that keep my children safe. So there's all sorts of things that I can do to keep my children safe. The person who's going to perpetrate will understand that I wouldn't want them to do what they want to do. So their job is to get me out of the way, or to trick me, or to persuade me that they're not interested sexually in children at all. So somehow the external inhibitor has to be manoeuvred so that they don't stop the abuse from happening. And I guess in the world of prevention, what we need to recognise is those external inhibitors can be made so much stronger than they are, because it remains the case that most families don't recognise the size of the risk, don't assume it could happen to their children, therefore don't assume that people around them, their family members, their friends, could possibly sexually harm a child. So because they don't think that's possible, they're not looking for the signs or recognising the signs when they're there. So there is much we can do in that place. So, and the final hurdle or obstacle, or in manipulating these external inhibitors or protectors, they have to overcome the victim's resistance, which is doing what they want to do with the child, grooming them. We will talk about the word grooming and how they got the child to a place of some level of acceptance of the sexual behaviour, and make sure, of course, they're not going to tell anything about what's gone on. So overcoming the victim resistance, yes, about doing it, but also getting away with it and potentially wishing to repeat that behaviour later on. So those are David Findlater's 4 preconditions. It's important to remember these individuals here, because at all of these stages there is a potential for prevention if we think seriously and hard about that and have a commitment to prevention. So that's one model, vitally kind of useful in educating the public and educating some children, but also in sex offender treatment programs available across the globe. Now, in terms of what treatment might look like, and I need to make some contrast between treatment of adults and then treatment with young people. This was the Wolvercote Clinic, residential clinic program, and operated, we had 305 residents went through this program over the period of 7 or 8 years. And these components are kind of common with many other sex offender programs across the globe. Components of the work are very familiar, and we start with this. So we need to help offenders understand the harm they've caused to victims. So victim awareness, be aware of that intellectually, but we also want to generate some victim empathy. We need them to feel badly about what they've done and feel that well, because these are warm-blooded human beings, we want them to get to a place where they feel badly not only about what they've done, but they commit themselves to not repeating the same harm again in the future. So an important kind of like journey that they have to make, and that might involve kind of becoming aware of the harm that was done to them when they were children, but we'll come to that in a wee while. Secondly, we need to also engage with them about their sexual fantasies. Sexual fantasy, we know deviant sexual fantasy is probably the strongest predictor of reoffending in known offenders. So deviant sexual fantasy, thinking about the things they would like to do, and typically masturbating to those sexual thoughts. This is the kind of the motor that drives the thinking, but also the behaviour and the offending. Therefore, we need to help learn the skills of recognizing sexual fantasy in all its forms, but also then in managing it and in steering fantasy to appropriate places, rather than fantasy about violence or fantasy about having sex of some kind with a child. So victim awareness, fantasy and offending, two kind of vital components. Then the other kind of features, we need to help offenders think about the issues of sexuality in relationships. These are adults. We need those adults to understand and to want a future good life that involves appropriate relationships with other adults, and potentially the involvement of some level, some kind of sexual life within the context of those relationships. So in moving offenders from past offending to a good life, then helping them to anticipate what future adult consenting non-abusive relationships will be like, and where their sex life may be expressed, is an important part of that. And that includes kind of developing kind of assertiveness and self-efficacy skills. What we discovered, rather a lot of child molesters, or kind of some would call them paedophiles, have really very poor self-esteem, but also therefore not good in interacting in an adult world and taking their place assertively in an adult world. So we need to teach them the skills of assertiveness and self-efficacy as well, within which to have those relationships with others, friendships, but also intimate relationships with friends and family. We always need to remind them, so offending pattern review is about reminding them all the time about their reason they're in treatment, the offending of the past, and just kind of gradually helping them to gather some insights about their past behaviour and their vulnerabilities, so that they're not only recognising what they did in the past, but also planning for their future good life that involved kind of relapse prevention. And so sexual abuse, we kind of learned much from the world of addictions, so alcohol or drug addictions, and therefore the terminology of relapse prevention, recognising the past risks, to avoid those risks in the future, and planning a life around avoiding those risks. And this other component I've just put up, learning from the past, is about engaging with the trauma that some of these adults now face when they were children. So they need to, if somehow their emotional and other development have been arrested because of trauma in their childhoods, maybe sexual abuse or physical violence or domestic abuse in their families, then we need them to face that, to look at it, to be supported in journeying through that, so that it doesn't remain an area of vulnerability that might make them vulnerable to committing sexual crimes in the future. So some therapeutic work around that. And yes, relapse prevention and the notion of good lives being an integral part of this journey with these key components. In residential treatment, each of these components ran for 2 weeks at a time solidly, and then we go around this cycle twice and have lots of written work. So we had a broadly cognitive behavioural treatment programme with some behavioural work for fantasy management and masturbation management alongside of that. And happy that people can email me separately about that if those are aspects that they want to understand a little bit more about. So if that was talking about adult sex offender programs and the labels of the kinds of things that we'll be doing and helping them to lead good lives and figure out what a future good life looks like. Well, with young people, this is a list that I would take from programs for young people, Safer Lives program, so very similar to the Good Lives idea, but critically front-ending with these aspects of healthy sexuality. How do we kind of decent sex and relationship education, vitally important for all of those who sexually harmed as children and young people. So give them good quality sex and relationship education, including kind of familiarity with what some of the growing up steps they'll go through, what some of the thoughts and the physical sensations and the rest of it, how their hormones will cause certain reactions of various kinds, and how that will resonate with other people around them. So we need to engage with them about those matters, and then critically talk about things like consent, things like respect, healthy touch. So there's a whole raft of things that need to be done, yes, at home a little, yes, in schools if we can, so that we're helping children. In fact, this is something that I would like all children to get, not just those who sexually harmed, but for those who have harmed in these ways, they need to learn these things about growing up, about understanding what is abuse, why was their behaviour abusive, what harm has it done, and also learning to become sexual in a safe way in the future. For those who've been abused, the fourth bullet point, then exploring their own abuse, and understand something, the next one, the steps towards sexual abuse. We need to spend a little time in kind of looking at their offending pattern. A bit like I say we'll do with adults, we need to do this with young people as well, so that their offending pattern is known to us and to them. Sometimes, you know, when did you start thinking about doing that? What kind of steps did you put in place maybe weeks or months before the sexual abuse happens? Or was it just in the half an hour beforehand or the 5 minutes beforehand? So we need to understand those things in order to figure out the best way to respond in treatment. Yes, we need to explore their sexual interests and what's informed those interests, where they get those ideas from, and certainly the relationship with the internet is a critical part of that. The consequences of sexual abuse, they need to understand what the harm that they've caused and the harm that sexual abuse causes. Again, a bit like the victim empathy and awareness, helping them to understand the harm that it would cause if they did it again. Hopefully, in their hearts, they wouldn't want to cause that kind of harm or distress to another human being. We need to talk about managing risk, because some people, and in fact many people initially, aren't going to be very good at managing their own risk. So we need to make sure that, as well as them managing their risk, that there are other people around them, typically family, but also maybe teachers, maybe social workers or youth justice workers, who can help manage their risk in that context. We need to give them the skills of communicating with others, a bit like the social skills I talked about with adults, and the relationship skills, so that they feel comfortable with their peer group, and their peer group that they respect and they value and they like, and with whom kind of friendships and other relationships may ultimately develop. Things like kind of anger management and assertiveness kind of development are aspects as well of these programs. So you can see the relationship between the adult programs, hopefully, and the children's programs, but again, it's kind of heading down and emphasizing the safer lives for the future aspect, critically important for young people and children, rather than simply hammering them down about the harm they've done in the past. We need to help them hopefully face their future and be excited and positive about it. Now I'm going to ask someone to tell me something about how the time's going, so that I know how we're getting on with time right now. We've got another 20 minutes. Excellent, thank you. So I'll pause for breath and have just a gulp of water. Okay. And can I just say, in terms of this next slide, which is kind of rather clumsily put together, I know, and I'm sorry for the shadowing effect in the title. I managed to put it on, and I couldn't manage to take it off before we presented. And I didn't want it. But anyway, there it is. So this is taking that same David Finkelhor model of the 4 preconditions and saying, kind of, what are we trying to do then to prevent repeat offending, to prevent the next offence happening? And how might we typify that? In the original model, we had this cloud of sex with a child as a large thought. Well, we've shrunk that. We want to reduce the sexual thinking about children and hopefully amplify the sexual thinking about peers or indeed about adults, so that it's consenting sex that's thought about rather than sex with someone significantly younger or smaller. So reduce the potency of that sexual fantasy and enhance the potency of other sexual thoughts and fantasies that would be respected. In treatment, we used to have a flip chart exercise where we used to item or compose a sexual fantasy. What is it all right to sexually think about, and what's not okay, so that we're helping people to be skilled about so they can stop their thoughts if they're developing in an inappropriate way. So if that's the first obstacle, then the second one is developing a conscience. In the previous model, we had this hurdle that they could jump over. We're trying to make their conscience robust and strong, a brick wall, so that it's much more difficult for them to get over it, because we're helping them to understand the harm that sexual abuse causes, and the damage it does to all relationships around their victim, but also around themselves, because it does rebound back on the offender, him or herself. So help to develop their conscience, so that gives them motivator to manage every conceivable circumstance going forward. So, and then the third item, external inhibitors. We're trying to ensure that the offender exists within a community of other adults, adults including authority figures as adults, so people who know them welcome them, so they're part of a wider community and feel that they take their place in that environment. So they're not looking to children to meet their needs, relationship needs or sexual needs, but they can meet those needs with the adults that are around them, that respect them, and that they can feel assertiveness, they can practice their assertiveness skills alongside of them. And by the way, there is a model in the UK that afterwards you may be interested to look at. It's called Circles of Support and Accountability, where if the individual offender himself doesn't have a natural circle of adults that we can grow around them, then we will recruit volunteers from the community, 5 or 6 community volunteers who will agree to be involved in the day-to-day life of a known sex offender for the next 12 months as a minimum, so that they're helping to shape up a normal life with appropriate adults around them, with whom they can have good relationships, and hopefully leapfrog from that place into their own independent life. And then kind of finally in this model, what we've got is how to make sure that the offenders are safe around children, and therefore that they don't overcome their child's resistance, is broadly speaking making sure the past perpetrator is no longer alone with children, that there are other adults around in that environment, so they're not in a position to cause the harm that they've done in the past. Ideally other adults who know of their past behaviour, so that they're very alert to the possibility of relapse and of harm. So that's just a way of representing what treatment might look like. And this is, I'll leave you to fathom this one out afterwards. This is one bringing together of all the components of a good life for young people. So there's kind of some models looking around. If you do a literature search about sex offenders' good lives, then you'll find literature that supports that. And this is essentially condensing all that and trying to represent it in our work with children and young people, so they understand what we're trying to get at and why these things are important. Having fun and achieving is part of that. Being healthy, having a good well-being, inner peace, being happy, having some independence. So these are all components we're helping young people and adults from sex offenders to actually move towards. Okay. So that's context. That's something about the model from David Finkelhor and about how offending happens, and something about sex offender treatment from adults, and also there's some similarities between treatment with young people. Then we can want to turn the last few minutes to looking at the challenge of preventing child sexual abuse, based on what I've just already told you, but also one more item. So David Finkelhor had this model that I've already shared with you, that is its 4 preconditions model, and we can take from this the people that could be involved in prevention. The beginning, the first 2 obstacles, this is the perpetrator, or at this stage they've not offended yet. So this is the potential perpetrator. So what can we offer to those people at an early stage so they don't go on to commit the crimes that they might otherwise commit? How do we reach out to them so they know if they're worried about their sexual thoughts, they can get help and they can get support in managing their sexual thoughts so they don't commit harm to a child? And that's what we've done in the Stop It Now helpline and the Stop It Now of the online kind of Get Help website, where, as I say, tens of thousands of UK citizens are going to the phone line, but also going to the website, troubled by their sexual behaviour online or troubled by their sexual thoughts, and getting support and help so they don't continue with their online behaviour or they don't do the harm they might otherwise do. So it is possible, with confidentiality and anonymity, to extend support to people who are troubled by their sexual thoughts. And sometimes we have to trigger that by doing advertising, to say to people, if you're worried about your sexual thoughts about children, then call this Stop It Now helpline. The same is we're doing lots of social media work about online sexual, kind of the viewing and consumption of child pornography, sending messages to lots of hordes of men online about that behaviour, and encouraging them to get help and support before they go on to do further harm. So these individuals have a vital part to play in not committing crimes to a child. And sometimes parents will be worried about the sexual behaviour of their child, or sometimes teachers will worry about maybe the sexually aggressive words or behaviours of a child or young person in their class. We must not ignore those signals. We must make sure we get help, professional support, so we respond well, so that hopefully we're helping a child or young person get back on the right track rather than progress to become a sex offender of tomorrow. So if that's one group of people, the potential perpetrators, we then, I've already indicated, the external inhibitors spoke. We can do, that's kind of community, family members, other people. We need to make them aware of the scale of the problem and the things they can do to protect children and the signs and indicators of abuse. And I'll come back to those in a minute, but we created for the Home Office in the UK a website called Parents Protect, where we put lots of signs and indicators. We put a family safety plan outline on there so that family members interested to keep their children safe can think about these matters, discuss them appropriately, and make their children safer in their home and extended environments. And then fourth and finally, how do we help those children who may become victims? How do we help them protect themselves? Well, partly by educating them about bodies, about good and bad touch, about respectful relationships. We want boys to learn respectful relationships particularly. We want boys and girls to learn about good and bad touch, and when to talk to an adult about a worry that we've got, a teacher or a parent, if we're worried about something that's going on or that may have happened to us. So if we help them to feel confident about their rights, about their bodies, about good and bad touch, about talking to a trusted adult, then we're making them less vulnerable, because sex offenders rely on victims being ignorant, but also victims not talking. If they see a child that is not ignorant and that talks well to their parents about all sorts of matters and that understands about touch, then that child is less likely to become a victim of sexual abuse. So using that model, we can think about those components. And using this model from broad criminology, we can think about another component. And I won't talk about, I mean, essentially the inner triangle here is simply saying for any crime, including child sexual abuse, all you need for any crime is a willing offender, is a target victim, and it needs to take place in a place. And then we can think, well, what differences can we make to places to make abuse less possible? And institutions need to take this thinking seriously, because institutions can make a massive difference to the environment where children are looked after, are cared for, and the environment where some children are abused. We can make changes to those environments to reduce the possibility of abusing children and certainly increase the likelihood of getting caught. So those items that I've talked about, and this looks a bit cluttered, but hopefully we're bringing the items from the previous two models over here. So the offenders or potential offenders in the left-hand column, offenders and potential offenders, thinking about them as people who would prevent abuse, thinking of victims, but before they're victims, they're just children. How can they play a part in prevention? How do families and communities play their part in prevention? And how can situations be changed so that they actively prevent abuse from happening? And the labels primary, secondary, tertiary prevention on the top. This is a public health model. And tertiary prevention involves all the things we do after the bad things happen, after abuse has happened. What do we do with offenders to make them less likely to offend? We can imprison them, we can give them treatment, we can manage them, we can put them on a sex offender register, all manner of things that reduce the risk of them reoffending. What do we do with victims? We can, after abuse, well, we can give them treatment programs. We know some things to do with victims. We don't do it well enough or often enough, but we know what most of those things are in the UK and I'm sure elsewhere in the globe. What can we do to families and communities after abuse so that they're safer for their children afterwards and for situations and places as well? We make changes that make them safer. But then primary and secondary prevention are all the things we can do before abuse has happened. Yes to potential offenders, yes to potential victims, yes to families where potential for sexual crimes will happen, and yes to situations where abuse might happen, but hasn't happened yet. So primary and secondary prevention are all about the things beforehand. The difference with secondary is secondary causes us to think about at-risk groups. Are there certain people at risk of becoming offenders? Are there certain people at risk of becoming victims? Are there certain families at greater risk? Are there certain situations that have a greater risk? So we need some disciplined thinking about those matters so that we have strategies for the general population, primary prevention, but also some strategies for at-risk groups, secondary prevention, and then strategies to respond afterwards when abuse has happened. Hopefully that makes sense. And just one or two examples of that. So treatment programs for convicted sex offenders in this model. they would go in tertiary prevention on offenders line. So sex offender treatment programs, prison sex offender registration are the kinds of things that prevent repetition of the crime. They don't stop it happening in the first place, they stop it happening again. Awareness raising prevention education programs for all parents and carers. Well, where would that go in this framework? Well, that would families and communities are where I'd put that, and it's primary prevention because it's for all parents and carers to give them the knowledge and the skills to keep their children safe. And here's a screenshot of the Parents Protect website that is available to you to go on as anyone in the UK if you're interested to visit. And here's some information that's also on there about red, amber, green kind of sexual behaviours in children and young people. Parents, teachers, youth workers need to understand what's normal and what's abnormal and worrying sexual behaviour in children and young people around them. So this is some information you'll find on the Parents Protect website. We need to get better at recognising relatively normal sexual behaviour in children, including very young children, and really gravely worrying sexual behaviour in some other children, including some other very young children. Another question about where it goes on the framework, primary school programme of personal safety and sex education for all 10-year-old children. Where would that go on this framework? Well, we have a programme in the UK, it's called Hedgehogs, that is all about children learning about touch and about respect and about some sexual development things that they'll go on to learn about because they're 10-year-old children and they're on the cusp of puberty. And we club that as to two components. It helps children be safer so they're not victims, but it also helps boys particularly to learn respectful relationships so they don't go on to become offenders. How's time going now? 5 minutes. Okay. I don't know.
We have some questions if you'd like to ask them.
Okay, so there's some questions coming in. Can I just finish off, get to a kind of a tidy place to finish. Yeah. This is another thing you might want to visit. The NSPCC have this is a dinosaur kind of, it's a video for 4 or 5-year-old children about, it's called Talking Pants. And it's just a very engaging song for children and for parents to sing. It's all about personal safety and that lots of schools are using with their children from a very early age to get through some messages about the right to privacy that they're entitled to. I talked about the Stop It Now helpline, so I won't engage with more about that. I will try and take us towards another place where we sorted out a bit of a plan. But if you've got 1 or 2 questions that you'd like to raise before I get to that final place, then raise a question.
Yeah, one of the questions is, I would like to understand how to prevent stigma attached to child sex offenders while they are being reintegrated into the community.
Well, I think that will be different from all our contexts. So stigma must relate to a level of knowledge about the offending behaviour. In the UK, the system is fairly cautious about the young person not being identified in any court proceedings, so therefore the public won't know. Yes, the school people will need to know, and that the child may need to move schools. But it's absolutely right that we need the young person after the crime they've committed to take their place in society as a responsible citizen, and therefore we can't afford. We make them riskier if we make them isolated and give them no hope for the future. So we need to reduce any potential stigma, but the systems need to be sensitive to that, and we all have a part to play: the police, the courts, the social workers, family members, and schools about making sure that we keep information as confidential as possible, as is consistent with keeping other children safe. Because the last thing we need is a young perpetrator who is enabled to commit offence against other children because parents were oblivious to the potential for risk.
The next question is, why is the words good and bad touch used instead of safe and unsafe?
Look, there are all sorts of international kind of discussions about, can we use the term child pornography, or do we have to use the indecent images of children? Good and bad touch, safe or unsafe touch. There are. I guess I don't feel strongly. I think I use words in engaging with parents, so that they understand what we're driving at, and I guess because we're starting from a common terminology, then that's why I would use these words. I want people to learn the lessons and to understand the nature of the problem, what they can do. I'm not trying to force them into accepting my theory about which word they should use. There are some people that have a strong view that parents need to be teach their children to use the proper words for body parts. Well, I've worked with lots and lots of parents who will refuse to do that, and certainly from and cultural sentiments as well. Well, if that becomes an obstacle to people learning lessons, we need to move the obstacle aside and allow them to use the language that works for them. Now, we might want that to do better than that tomorrow, but today we need them to learn the lessons and to implement the lessons so their children are safer. Anything else? Okay, can I just finish off with a problem and a place and a plan? So this is, and this was a privilege to be involved in this project. This is from Queensland. This was the newspaper headline that was rather sensational. The problem, and the problem was about youth-perpetrated sexual violence. And this is one place where the youth-perpetrated sexual violence was taking place. A lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island young people, so Indigenous peoples in this very deprived area of this city in in Queensland, and the green patch in the map that you can see. This is the design of the area where the roads go nowhere, and then there's green spaces and trees and wasteland, and this is where children, young people were being, well, young girls were being sexually abused in large numbers, and it was mostly young boys doing it. When I say young boys, talking about boys between 12, 18, 19, 20, talking about young girls, talking about girls between 10 and 17, 18, and there was some other young boys. They were kind of from 8, 9, 10, and they would go to watch the sexual abuse taking place. So this was very violent. They talked about rough sex taking place. And this has been ongoing for a large number of years. The community doesn't know what to do, and there's a history to the Aboriginal peoples that mean that their parenting is not something that would constrain this behaviour. Now, this is a list of the issues that we discovered in this place. And what brought it to attention were the teen pregnancies, high level of sexually transmitted infections, and the significant victims and offender populations were from the local Indigenous populations. There were lots of community problems of violence, alcohol and substance misuse, lots of rape going on of girls in particular, but some women and certainly some tourists in the area would be pulled into that, and of girls also being exploited through, in their terms, trading sex. So this was girls being involved in child sexual exploitation, being exploited in all sorts of ways. The family problems were many, high levels of family violence, a lot of poverty in the area, a loss of respect for parental or adult controls of any kind, and adults therefore had almost given up on any kind of monitoring of their children. There were lots of youth gangs and the conflict between gangs, so a lot of physical violence mixed into all of this mess. And there was a clan structure that meant that clans from one Aboriginal group to another actually were involved in significant levels of violence. Yes, male sense in this place, and it's something that I've encountered really rather strongly here in India too, a strong sense of male sexual entitlement and a lack of respect for girls. And I've already indicated high rates of sexually transmitted infections, and there's no discussion with the young people at all, girls or boys, about consent. Sex is something that boys take and that girls are supposed to just submit themselves to. And there's lots of barriers to reporting, a massive disrespect of the police, and a fear of the police, and the police, ultimately these areas create no-go zones. The police would be at risk if they try to enter them. And yeah, victims are blamed enormously for this behaviour, because men are entitled to, and boys are entitled to take what they want from the girls. So this was the theme, and as I say, I think there's some parallels in one or two places potentially here in India as well. So thinking, well, what kind of intervention should they be developing? The police could arrest one or two of these individuals and put them on treatment programs that we've talked about, but that gets nothing close to the scale of the problem, or indeed the setting circumstance of the problem. If there's one youth you can arrest, there's another 10 or 20 or 50 who are doing the same behaviour you're not arresting, who will continue doing it, because that's what they have learned to expect. And you don't report it to the police, and most people get away with it. So if we want to make changes for the sake of children, all these young people, the boys and the girls and their families, then we have to have a strategy that's not just about arresting one or two bad people. And I've included this list in the questions we were asking that probably time won't allow me to cover. But we did spend some time understanding the nature of the problem, the places where it arose, why boys thought it was okay to do what they did, when they went, what nights of the week, why girls tolerated the behaviour, why they didn't report to the police. So what are the conditions that enable but also perpetuate the behaviour, and why is it that parents, adults, weren't being effective guardians of children in this place? And this is the plan. This is the plan that I'll put back on the framework in a second, where we're trying to create safer public spaces, including using improved and targeted police patrols, supported by community night patrols. If the police weren't a trusted body, we needed the community who were struggling with this problem to realise the police were an important ally in trying to tackle the problem. An ally in child protection, not an ally just in arresting a few young people, an ally in keeping children safe. Then we did some designing outwork. So we put lighting in and CCTVs in the park areas. We actually planted some prickly thorn bushes and some sprinkler systems to essentially dislodge some of the sexual behaviour and create a kind of some decent youth environments with youth workers, Indigenous youth workers available, so that we're giving alternative pro-social activities for the young people to go to, but also providing some awareness and safety education in those youth places for at-risk groups, at-risk boys, but also at-risk girls. And these are the public spaces were where most of the abuse was taking place, and partly the youth were there because homes weren't necessarily safe. So we also then tried to make sure homes became safer by clarifying with the adults in the community what was appropriate sexual behaviour in themselves and in the children and young people they were responsible for, and educating and equipping some parents with improved parenting skills. And then creating safer youth networks so that youth was respectful of each other and protective of each other, so that actually boys were stopping other boys from doing egregious bad things to girls, and that girls were keeping each other safe from doing risky things and going to places they shouldn't go. So helping that through sex ethics and guardianship program for youth, and then some therapeutic interventions for children, for the girls particularly, who had already been victimised. So a range of things that fit into the framework of prevention that I'm showing up right now. So I guess it's saying that youth perpetrating sexual violence, we need to understand not only the individual specifics of how it happens for an individual, but what's the context, what's their family understanding of the problem, what are the enablers and the facilitators, what changes can we make not just in the young person's own mind and behaviours, but in the family component and in the public places they go to, and in the peer groups, and in the education setting, and in the youth setting that they inhabit, so that together we create a safer culture for all our children. And this is all written up. If you want to find out more, drop me an email and I can send you the reports about this behaviour, because child sexual abuse is preventable. It's not inevitable. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. And if you do you have any more questions? Yes, Manju, do you have a question? Can you just type out your question? You'll need to click on the questions and type in a question. It's on the right-hand column. Manju, do you want to talk? Okay, can you see questions in chat at the bottom? I think you need to type in your question. Okay, one participant is interested in knowing about the sex offenders registry. Are those on the registry convicted? You have to unmute yourself.
Okay, I've just unmuted myself. So, yes, sex offender register. So yeah, the sex offender register in the UK is only for with a criminal conviction or a police caution for sexual crimes, mostly against children, but there are some kind of more grievous crimes against adults that you can end up on the register for. And you're on the sex offender register for different amounts of time. The shortest period is 2 years, the longest period is inevitably life, and that is determined by the length of sentence that you got. So if you go to prison for 2 or 3 years, you'll be on the register for life when you come out. If you get a very short prison sentence, then that could be between 5 years and 10 years on the register. If you don't go to prison at all, you may get a fine or a community service order. Then you may be on the register between 2 and 5 years. So there's a range of periods of time on the register. For children and young people on the register, that they will normally do half the adult period on the register, so that they come off the register quicker. And being on the register, we don't have a public register. It's not available to the public. The register is entirely for professionals to know about who's on it and assess and manage the risk of those on it. Police, probation service, health, local authorities, schools, etc. So they know who's on the register, but the public doesn't, and apart from in extreme circumstances if someone is seen to represent a risk to the broadest public. But there is another mechanism that doesn't involve conviction. We have an organisation called the Disclosure and Barring Service that is to do with employment vetting. If I want to work in the children's workforce in the UK as a volunteer, as an unsupervised volunteer, or as a worker, I have to. My employer has to then check my criminal records check, which partly is checking for whether I have a criminal conviction, which isn't about whether I'm on the register, just have I got a conviction, but also they check for whether the Disclosure and Barring Service may have barred me because of my previous behaviour. So I can be barred from working with children without being convicted, but because on 2 or 3 occasions I lost my job because of improper behaviour around children. So there's more than one mechanism to keep the workforce safer from sex offenders than simply the sex offender register. Hope that answers enough.
Okay, this is the last question for this webinar, which we're going to be ending in 3 minutes. What are measures to ensure that adolescents are not reoffending post-treatment? How is it being mapped?
Could you read that? Are not?
What are measures to ensure that adolescents are not reoffending post-treatment, and how is it being mapped?
Okay, so I mean, clearly it depends on the circumstances. If we're talking, because if we have a number of mechanisms, if a young person comes to attention, then and the police investigate the crime, there are a number of mechanisms that would divert the young person from the criminal justice system, so they don't end up being adjudicated, and therefore don't end up on the sex offender register. But are diverted into some kind of treatment environment to make sure that they're kept safe. But others will go through clearly adjudication, criminal justice, and potentially custody, and then coming out. So it depends which mechanism. If they're on the register, of course, then our public protection arrangements, the police, probation, youth justice, health, etc. They will have the list of all the registered sex offenders, including the youth, on it, and their job is to assess the risk of each of those individuals based on a close understanding their past behaviour, and then they'll have a risk management plan and a treatment plan that responds to that understanding and that risk. So they are tracked over time, and there's been some studies done particularly by an academic, Simon Hackett, at Durham University, looking at the reconviction rate of those adjudicated children and young people. Clearly, if they're not adjudicated and therefore they don't have a criminal conviction, then there are other mechanisms that agencies will try to put in place to monitor kind of risk going forward. But the piece of work that needs to be done with them in the short term is going to involve not only the young person, the treatment work, not only the young person, but their family, and maybe one or two other key adults. The school will need to be involved, but also if they're in out-of-home care, then that environment, or foster parents, they will be involved. So there'll be regular reviews of the young person's progress, but also about their continuing behaviour. So there'll often be some flagged behaviour that's deemed to be appropriate or inappropriate that people keep a close eye on. So there are two systems that operate that give us some information about the future behaviour of those young people, whether they're adjudicated or whether they're not.
Thank you very much, Donald.
And thank you all for attending. We will keep you all informed of the next time we're doing a webinar through our Facebook page and through our blog. Thank you.
Thank you.
You too? So how did you think? It's pretty exhausting, isn't it?